friends, welcome back or welcome if you're new here. My name is Stacy and I am the Chapter Conundrum, and in today's video I have a fun one for you guys. I'm going to be ranking all of the 2025 releases that I read last year. We have 18 books to talk about spanning all kinds of different genres, so it was a little interesting to put these in a ranking. Especially because I think 7 of them have the same rating. But I thought even better because then you guys get a little bit more detail into how I felt about them and hopefully can decide which of these might be worth your time and maybe which of these won't be worth your time if you have similar reading taste to me and would have similar complaints. So yeah, without further ado, let's go ahead and get into it. And coming in at number 18, we have my worst book of the year, which is sad that it was a new release and that I read it like pretty soon after release, but it is The Things Gods Break by Abigail Owen, and this is the second book in the Crucible trilogy. I read and enjoyed book 1 back in October. I think I gave that a 3.5-star rating, but this one I gave a 2-star rating to. And it's not that it's necessarily a bad book, it's that it's really not a Stacy book. So what I mean by that is the way this was structured, it just did not work for me as a reader at all. In book 1, you follow our main character who is chosen by Hades to compete in some trials to see who the next ruling Greek god will be. And so book 1 really follows the trials and the competition element, which I enjoyed. In book 2, we pick up right from the ending of book 1, but some new things are kind of thrown at the reader and not really explained a whole lot. So right away you're getting sucked kind of into some different stuff that feels a little bit like a mindfuck situation. So you're jumping from scene to scene with characters and you don't really understand like why this is happening. It's not necessarily in chronological order. It doesn't make a ton of sense other than it feels like the author's purposefully trying to manufacture your experiencing certain moments with the characters. And that to me was really frustrating as somebody who's not a character reader. I was really in this series for the plot elements and the competition. And so this was a big disappointment for me, not only because it didn't feel like it had any kind of organic flow to it, but also just kind of like the logic behind everything. Even once you got some answers, I still had a lot of questions. Didn't love how this was told or structured, and yeah, it was just a big frustration for me. Coming in at number 17, we have a book that I at least was enjoying for the most part until the twist happened and it ruined everything. And if you've been following Thrill Chill or Kill, you probably already know that is Beautiful Ugly by Alice Feeney. And this one was just a disappointment. This is not like it was a problem for me. This is like the book is a problem kind of scenario. So for me, I actually really liked a lot of this up until the main reveal. And then once we got that, it made zero sense. Things that were layered into the story beforehand now had like logical flaws. And it just didn't make sense for the character motivations or like what we knew of them moving forward for the future either. It almost felt like this was a scenario of where Alice Feeney had written a different ending and then somehow in editing she ended up changing it and didn't really think about making other changes in hindsight. It felt like it wasn't really thought through, and it overall was just really frustrating. I think for me, this was extra disappointing because I have read and enjoyed several of her other books, like His and Hers, Rock, Paper, Scissors, and Daisy Darker. I liked all of those. So yeah, this one was such a dud and such a bummer for me. Coming in at number 16, we have The Man Made of Smoke by Alex North. And I had previously read and enjoyed The Whisper Man, but this was a 2.5-star read for me. So in here you're following Dan, and when he was a kid, he had like a near miss kind of encounter with a serial killer kidnapper, and it really kind of shaped who he became. He ended up deciding to become a criminal profiler and do some like psychological work with people who are either convicted or accused of things. But his dad, who is a retired police officer, was looking into a cold case relating to the serial killer that Dan had a near miss with, and he disappears. So this is really Dan's story of trying to figure out what happened to his dad and if it is in fact related to this serial killer. And for me, I liked the premise of this one, but I just didn't really get attached or invested into anything that was happening in the story. Most of the time, books can pull me in, and I maybe should have DNF'd this one just because it wasn't the most riveting, but I also had a similar experience with the beginning of The Whisper Man, and then something happened that pulled me in and I got really invested and I ended up loving it. But The Man Made of Smoke just didn't have that moment for me, and I never really got invested. And then once we got to the ending, I just felt like everything was overly rushed in that section. And so it just kind of had like this weird juxtaposition with the pacing being like really slow in the beginning and then really rushed in the ending. So yeah, overall, this one was not my favorite, and yeah, it comes in my number 16 slot. At number 15, I never would have anticipated this being so low on a ranking, and that is With a Vengeance by Riley Sager, who I would previously have said is like pretty consistently a favorite author for me. The last 3 books he's published now, so With a Vengeance, the only one left, In the Middle of the Night, weren't my favorites by him. Like the previous 5 he did before that, I absolutely loved, and the lowest rating I had given any of those was a 4. I think only one left got a 4. Middle of the Night maybe got a 3.75. With a Vengeance got a 3, a generous 3 at that. Yeah, big time disappointment for me for sure. And in this one, you follow Anna Matheson, who is orchestrating this meetup of some people on a train journey who had a hand in plotting against her family and wreaking some havoc with things that pertain to her dad. And she ultimately kind of wants some revenge. So she's planned for the FBI to meet this train at its destination and arrest the passengers. The only problem is, near the beginning of this train journey, someone on board ends up being murdered, and it appears that whoever the killer is going after other passengers and possibly framing Anna for this. So with that premise, this should have been really exciting, right? No. Riley Sager in here used the same twist, I think like 3 times, at least twice anyway. The first time it was fine. The second time it was just frustrating. And honestly, I'm pretty sure it was 3 times, but I can't really remember now because I just want to put this one out of my brain and forget about it. But beyond that, something I really don't tend to enjoy in my mystery thrillers is when you have a closed circle scenario like this and the characters are spending so much of the narration of the book postulating and guessing at their theories at what's happening. I much prefer to create my own theories based on information that they're experiencing and not necessarily get all their thoughts. I don't like the feeling of being frustrated with them because their logic may not be sound. Like they may postulate something that we know to be impossible because of other logic and other things that we know, and it's just like, this feels like a waste of time. Like we know this isn't the answer. It feels like it's a red herring thrown in on purpose. And beyond that, I just much prefer to get their emotional reaction as to what's happening and less so their logical postulations on what could be happening. So yeah, for a bunch of reasons, this one ended up just being sucky for me in comparison to Riley Sager's other books. It didn't play into my taste and it wasn't that great. So massive disappointment there. Coming in the number 14 slot on this ranking, we have Happy Endgame, which is volume 8 in the I Hate Fairyland graphic novel series. And this is a really fun graphic novel series that follows Gertrude as she is trapped in her 6-year-old self's body because she got sucked into fairyland and never figured out how to get home. She's now in her 30s, trapped in this young body, and she is just salty and over it at this point, and she's wreaking all kinds of havoc in fairyland. So this is just a really fun, humorous, comedic kind of story where she's just into all kinds of shenanigans, and it's entertaining. The problem is, by this point in the series, I just felt like this is just more of the same fare. Like, by now, I want some development, some growth, some changes. And it's kind of clear that this series is just going to have one thing that it just keeps going and going and going and going with. And I don't see this ending anytime soon. I will say this does kind of arguably potentially end the first story arc of the series. So it was interesting to see that and kind of have like a full circle moment in the ending of this. I'm undecided whether I want to keep going with this series or not. I think I'm going to wait and see if Volume 9 is available via my library or Hoopla before I make a final decision, or at least to read some reviews for what the new story arc will be and kind of suss that out. But yeah, I liked this one. I just had some complaints with it and kind of am over the gimmick at this point. Coming in at number 13, we have Great Big Beautiful Life by Emily Henry. And I rated this one a 3.5 stars. So finally, we're into the ranking of books that I actually enjoyed. And in this one, you follow, I think, 2 prospective authors, and they are both going out to be the writer of this famous woman's memoir. And people in society just have a lot of questions about this famous woman, what kind of happened to make her disappear out of the limelight, what's going on with her family, because I guess her family was famous. But it's also the romance between these 2 authors. And I thought for this one, like, this really kind of read a little bit more like historical fiction. In some ways, it felt like a love letter to Evelyn Hugo by Taylor Jenkins Reid, which I enjoyed. But this one just wasn't as compelling in that regard. And for this being marketed as a contemporary romance, I just wanted a lot more focus on the romance. I also got a little bit frustrated with the third act conflict in this one because it's something that's so obvious that the characters mention like over and over and over to the buildup of that part of the story, and you're like, okay, well, if you know this is going to be a potential issue, like, why not address it earlier? But here we are, still harping on the same thing. There was just kind of some things like that that didn't lend to the most enjoyable experience for me, but I still had a good time with certain elements of this one. Definitely the reveals pertaining to this famous character's backstory and like her story were the standout moments of this book for me, and what kind of drove the pacing forward. So pick it up because you're interested in that aspect and not necessarily interested in the contemporary romance. People also do say that with Emily Henry, you tend to love one of her books and just like her other books. And so far, that has held true with me. Funny Story is my favorite for sure. And for the most part, the rest have been decent for me, although I do have a 2-star book by her too. But that's a tangent. Anyhow, next up on the ranking, we have the new John Mars release that was in 2025, You Killed Me First. And in the beginning of this, you follow Margot, who wakes up tied up and bound in a bonfire. She's got a Bluetooth headset in her ear, and she's gotten a phone call from the person who has put her in this scenario. And this story is kind of like the lead up to everything about how we got to this moment and kind of what happens. So this was definitely kind of a departure from what I was used to with John Mars, but I did really still enjoy a lot of moments in here. I think for me, my main issue was that there was one element to the story that I didn't necessarily fully find believable or fully grasp. So I wanted kind of that to either be a little bit different or just not there. And it definitely affected my enjoyment enough to lower my rating as much as it did. But otherwise, I really liked the character dynamics in here. I liked following 3 women in the same neighborhood and sort of their dynamic with each other and kind of like what they were experiencing in their day-to-day lives and how they were coping with that. It was just interesting to see those elements play out here. I also didn't really predict the final reveals of this one, so that was fun, and I enjoyed the experience for what it was. Getting into my whole chunk of 4-star reads now, coming in at number 11, we have Out of the Woods by Hannah Bonham Young. This is the second book in the Out duology, and the first one being Out on a Limb, which made it to my top 10 books of the year. This one I liked, but I didn't love nearly as much as Out on a Limb. So I think for me, the standout element of Out on a Limb was the character banter. And so I was hoping that some of that like sass and humor would kind of like make it more into this book. And there were some moments in here, but the character voice was just not the same. Obviously, we're following a different main character, the best friend of the character from book 1. And so that's part of it. But I also just didn't gravitate as much towards what the main characters were kind of like struggling with and grappling with in their personal lives in this one. And so it just didn't end up being as compelling a read for me, even though I still found a lot to like and still enjoyed it. And in here you follow high school sweethearts Sarah and Caleb. Well, I think they're in their 30s now, so they've been married since they were really young. And they have kind of started to have a little bit of a falling out and some struggles. And so they decide to go on this like hiking retreat for couples with other couples and with a counselor along the way. And it's really about their kind of journey finding their way back to each other from there. Coming in at number 10, we have another sequel in a romance duology where book 1 made it to my top 10 of the year, but book 2 did not. And this one is Dating and Dragons, the sequel to Dungeons and Drama by Christy Boyce. So Dating and Dragons follows a completely different set of characters. I'm not really honestly sure why it's in the same series, other than these are both young adult romances that involve D&D set in Ohio. Like, that's really the only connecting thread here. That said, I did really enjoy all the nerdy elements to this one as well. I did like that we got to follow along a little bit more with the D&D campaign in this one. I forget our main character's name in this one at this point because it has been a while since I picked this up and read it. But what I do remember is that she's new in town and she ends up being invited to join this D&D group from a girl that she gets acquainted with at school, and she accepts, but this D&D group has some pretty like specific rules because they stream all of their games. And I can't remember what all the rules were other than like you can't miss any sessions, like no phones at the session, and like no dating other people in the group kind of thing, which she thinks is going to be fine, but then she ends up developing a crush on one of the other members, and it's reciprocated, and so it's kind of like a forbidden romance in a young adult romance trope. So obviously the nerdy goodness of the D&D campaign stood out to me here, but one other trope that I discovered last year that I really tend to enjoy is meddling grandma. And this has one of the finest meddling grandmas. She has definitely got a plan and she's orchestrating things behind the scenes, and it's just really funny to see what she comes out with. And it's just endearing to really see her character. I did really enjoy the romance of this one, though I did think it was a little bit frustrating that we didn't get to see the main characters together as a couple for very much of the book. This book really followed the kind of lead up to their getting together sort of thing. But yeah, it was enjoyable for me. It just didn't hold the same sparkle as book 1 in the series. Coming in the number 9 spot, we have Holy Disruptor. I forget all the subtitle for this one. I think it's like Shattering the Shiny Facade with the Truth. I'll put it on the screen anyway. And this is by Amy Duggar King. And if you don't recognize that name, she is touted as Crazy Cousin Amy on the TLC show, I think 21 Kids and Counting, or I think they changed the number when they had more kids. It might have been 19 Kids and Counting, and then it increased. Anyhow, she's Cousin Amy from the show. And this is really her story. So I expected in this one to kind of get like more of her life story and as well as her experience with the show, which we did get. But something I didn't really expect is to get kind of the backstory of some of her older family members. So like her parents and her grandparents. So that kind of stuff was really interesting for me and something I didn't really know about. I did kind of wish that we dug a little bit more into things that I didn't already know from some of the Duggar sisters, so like the main kids of the TLC show, because I feel like a lot of this in that section where she's talking about her experience with the TV show is like pretty much the same experience that like Jill had when she talks about it in her book. And Will is definitely very understandable. They had such a similar experience with the same show, the same family, the same people kind of thing. I did kind of feel like Amy was going to have a bit more to bring to the table because she wasn't raised in the same culture that they were. And so I thought she would have maybe more of a different perspective to add. And she definitely had a couple of mentions of things in that vein about how her cousins like viewed her and how they treated her differently if she did different things kind of based on their own beliefs, which was interesting to read about for sure. I did really enjoy what she had to say here. It was just a lot of what she had to say were things that I already knew from some of her cousins' books. So yeah, it didn't hold the same kind of spark or enjoyment for me, which is why it is this far down my ranking. Coming in the number 8 spot, we have The Trial of Rooker Flynn, the second book in the Locke Institute trilogy by A.R. Witham. And this is a fun indie published series set in the world of Keymark, so the same world as his previous books, where you follow Jack Swift and Rooker Flynn as they are put into the Locke Institute, which is kind of like a prison or labor camp of sorts. And this series is really about their friendship dynamic, kind of how they're surviving and trying to thrive in this environment, what they get up to, the relationships they build with other inmates, and kind of all the shenanigans they get up to with that. So obviously I can't tell you too much about this one specifically, given that it's book 2 in the trilogy, but I can tell you that the standout moments of this one were absolutely the characters. I really enjoy Rooker's character arc in this installment, and I also really like one of the side characters in here, Patch, who I didn't really expect to have such a touching story from the first installment, but I really gravitated to her more in this book. This definitely also maintains its really snappy, kind of fast, succinct pacing, and also balances humor and horror elements really well, which is interesting to see. So I definitely had a really good time reading this one for sure, and I also particularly enjoyed some of the backstory stuff that was introduced in this installment. I think what I didn't connect to as strongly in this particular one was the plot. I feel like I enjoyed the comedic elements and the shenanigans that were like so creative and so dazzling in book 1 that reading this one that focused a little bit more on the characters didn't have those elements as strongly, had me a little bit like, oh, I missed that, because I was hoping for more of that kind of thing. Still overall a really great book, and definitely understand that, you know, it has to balance with character work too. And I'm really eager to see how this series ends up wrapping up. Coming in at number 7, we have another memoir. This one's Sherry Frankie's With the House of My Mother. And if you don't recognize that name, she's the oldest daughter in the Frankie family, who were a family vlog sensation on YouTube years ago with the channel called 8 Passengers. And her mom and the family counselor have since been arrested and charged on like abuse and neglect related charges. So you can imagine like the harrowing content of this memoir for sure. This was not an easy read. There were definitely things in here that hurt your heart as you're reading, but it's definitely an important read. Not only does Sherry share her experiences, but she also shares what she tried to do for her siblings once she was like older and moved on to college or university, and kind of like how the system in some ways got in her way and wasn't very helpful. And so I think it introduces a really interesting discussion and look into kind of like how the system is structured now, how it could be improved. And I just think it's a really interesting kind of eye-opening read in those elements. And I also just enjoyed what she had to say on being involved in a family vlog from a young age and kind of all the points that she made towards that as well. It's been so long since I've read this one that I can't really remember much more than that. So yeah, I know I gave it a 4. I don't remember why I lowered my rating, but it definitely comes in the number 7 spot on my ranking. Coming in at number 6, we have Sunrise on the Reaping, the newest installment in the Hunger Games series by Suzanne Collins, and this one followed Haymitch's games. So while I thought it was really interesting to follow the second quarter quell and kind of like see how that all unfolded, because we only knew real snippets from the main trilogy. I mean, we knew kind of like that Haymitch won, obviously, that he was the victor. We knew how he won, and we sort of knew like the odd tidbit about his arena and that his quarter quell was one where they reaped double the tributes. But beyond that, it was interesting to kind of flesh out a lot more details about this. And unlike Ballad of Songbirds and Snakes, it was much more interesting to be in the perspective of someone in the Hunger Games again. What I didn't necessarily love about this particular one is that there were elements to it that felt very fan servicey. So there are definitely interactions with other characters that you know from the original trilogy, and they're just not what I would have expected given how Haymitch first reacts to them. Like, there's clearly some kind of dynamic has shifted, and I don't really understand what that is, and we aren't really given an explanation as to like why his perspective or behavior towards these people have changed between the events of the books. So that was a little bit frustrating. Like, it just felt like it's definitely fan servicey and that like, oh, they're a fan favorite, so we have to like them in this installment, whereas Haymitch didn't necessarily react to them that way in the original trilogy. And I think it's honestly just a glaring issue with Suzanne Collins' books, because I had a similar complaint with Ballad, where there was a character in there that was like night and day, had a different relationship with one of the other characters, and there's no explanation as to why this massive shift or change has happened. So yeah, kind of frustrating that way, which definitely brought down my rating a bit. But it was interesting to finally fill in more details of Haymitch's story, and I definitely enjoyed the ride. Coming in at number 5, we have Witchcraft for Wayward Girls by Grady Hendrix. And this is a story that follows a bunch of teenage girls who have found themselves pregnant. But it's set, I forget what decade, I want to say like the 50s, 60s, older anyway. Back when it was like common in society for families to kind of send these girls away from home to live out their pregnancy, have their babies, give them up for adoption, and then come home and kind of pretend societally that nothing has happened. And so this story follows a bunch of girls brought to one of those homes where they are, through some means, introduced to witchcraft and use that to kind of get some revenge on some people who are doing some pretty terrible things to them. So overall, I absolutely loved the first half of this, and I thought this was going to get the full 5-star treatment from me. We spent a lot of time with the characters in a slower beginning, sort of like understanding the experience they were having, getting their reactions to everything that that experience entailed, and that part was really fascinating for me. But in the second half, this got a lot more action based, and because of that, I felt like I was missing some of the character emotion through some of the most like bigger stuff in the story. And so that brought my rating down a little bit, but I still had a really good time with it and would definitely recommend. But make sure you look up content and trigger warnings for this one if you feel like you need to, because there were definitely a lot in here. Coming in the number 4 spot, we have another sequel to another book I read in October, but unlike The Things That Gods Break, this one was much better for me, and that is Nate by Ali Hazelwood. In here, you follow the best friend of our main character from book 1, so you follow Serena. And this one has some interesting dynamics between the politics of like the humans, the vampires, and the werewolves. And it also has a combo of like the fated mates but forbidden romance trope, which I thought was an interesting pairing that I hadn't really seen done. And I definitely enjoyed the ride on this one. I will say this is probably Ali Hazelwood's spiciest book to date, so just be aware of that. If that's something you tend to enjoy in her books or not, that's probably going to play into how much you enjoy it reading this one. But I definitely enjoyed the characters and the romance in this one. I just kind of wanted the actual plot to be a little bit more developed and fleshed out, especially towards the end. I had a good time, and I gave that one a 4.25-star rating. My number 3 book also got a 4.25-star rating from me, and that was Rebel Witch by Kristen Ciccarelli, the second book in the Crimson Moth duology. And in this series, you follow Rune, who is a vigilante witch helping to rescue other witches that have been captured by the witch hunters, and she ends up fake dating Gideon, who is a guard in the witch hunter, to try and suss out more intel in order to help rescue these witches. And Gideon is interested in fake dating her to suss out whether she is potentially the Crimson Moth, this vigilante witch that is helping the other witches escape. So this was a really tension-filled ride that had me on an emotional roller coaster at times. I definitely loved seeing some of the moments in here between the characters and just how tense the story was. I did think that the first book in this series was stronger for me. This one felt a little bit more in the YA space for me, and book one felt a little bit more new adult-ish. And also, this one dealt a little bit more with the miscommunication trope. It's definitely very understandable with the scenario that's introduced here, and it made sense and it was logical. But I know not everyone loves that, so do with that what you will. But I definitely ended up enjoying seeing the conclusion of this, especially with how the plot and the bigger picture story with everything played out. This is definitely a series that I can see myself going back to and rereading someday. It was just a lot of fun, and it was fast-paced and interesting, and it definitely had me experiencing all kinds of emotions on the ride. Coming in at number 2, we have Sherry LaPena's 2025 release, She Didn't See It Coming. And in here you follow, I forget the name of the main character, but anyhow, you follow him as he's getting a phone call because his wife has neglected to pick up their child from daycare. And so he ends up going to get their child, coming home, and realizing that his wife is nowhere to be found. She's disappeared. She's not answering her phone. And like her wallet and her phone and all that are in the apartment where they live. And so he gets the police involved, and this follows the police investigation into her disappearance. So true to Sherry LaPena's signature style, she definitely introduces a compelling mystery with a lot of potential red herrings and a lot of moving pieces. I definitely enjoy her characters, but the standout elements of reading her books for me are the amount of theories I get to have along the ride. Like, I always have guesses as to, oh, this person could have done it because of this, or maybe this person over here did it because of this. She definitely is really intentional about creating really credible red herrings that have you really questioning who could have done this, because she creates multiple suspects and makes them all seem very plausible. And I definitely enjoy her thrillers for that, and I love the ride of them. Also, her books are typically narrated by January Lavoie, who is an amazing thriller audiobook narrator, and this one was no exception. I absolutely loved the audio experience of it as well. This one didn't end up being my favorite Sherry LaPena. It actually didn't even make it to my top 3 of her books, but I still rated it a 4.25 star and had a good time with it. I think the main reason that my rating on this one is a little bit lower is that, like, some of the red herring stuff introduced things that I still was wondering about at the end. It felt like we got some subplots instead of just like little clues, and I really wanted just more information on that and why it wasn't the answer type of thing. And then finally, coming in at my number 1 2025 release, the one that I had the best rating for last year, was Onyx Storm by Rebecca Yarros, the 3rd book in the Empyrean series. And this might be a bit of a shock to some people because I know Onyx Storm is not the fan favorite in that series for sure. But I had kind of some complaints with the earlier installments with the series where I really felt like in some ways Rebecca Yarros was really more of a romance author trying to write fantasy. It felt like she didn't really have a lot of planned foreshadowing, a lot of explanation to her reveals, a lot of like fantasy world building or context for things that she was putting in the story. But Onyx Storm had me completely rescinding that theory because this is where all of those elements came out. The pacing in this one really slowed down, and I enjoyed it so much more for seeing all those things. I loved getting reveals that pertain to things that were introduced in earlier books that I didn't even understand at the time were like foreshadowing for something to come. So that was really fun to get that experience of like all the good information from those earlier books in hindsight were like relevant to the plot. And it was clear that she really made a plan at this point. I also didn't even necessarily care too much that the romance wasn't at the forefront of this installment because I was so happy and satisfied getting all of those elements that I had been frustrated were kind of lacking or missing in the earlier installments. And so for me, it was just a really satisfying reading experience that way. I am also really intrigued with the series going forward based on how this one ended. And I just loved all the reveals that this one had along the way. I'm really hoping that in the next installment in the series, we continue on what we've kind of like built up with this installment and continue on seeing some of those elements shine through in her writing, but time will tell for sure. I'm definitely going to be picking it up. I'm just not guaranteed to absolutely love it, but I am guaranteed to at least have a good time with it. So that was it for me ranking all of the 2025 releases that I read in 2025. Definitely let me know down below in the comments what some of your favorite releases of last year were that you read. And let me know if you've read any of the ones on my ranking and if you agreed or disagreed with my thoughts. As always, thank you guys so much for watching. Don't forget to hit like and subscribe on your way out if you want to, and have a great day. Bye!